And so I'm going to take prerogative as a commissioner and say, let's go ahead and get started. People will continue to join us. We have lots of interesting things to share, and we want to make sure we have time for everyone.
Good. Well, welcome everyone to the 2023 IES Principal Investigators Meeting, and I'm so glad that you were able to make it despite the technical difficulties. And I'm Eun-Soo Cho, an assistant professor at Michigan State University and one of the co-chairs of this year's PI meeting. Despite being another virtual event, I hope that this meeting will provide us with valuable learning opportunities and also engaging ways to connect with our colleagues across the country. As we come together to celebrate the 20th anniversary of IES, we also acknowledge the significant challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. So our live opening plenary session aims to highlight the positive contributions of education sciences to the ongoing pandemic recovery efforts. We hope to offer insights and perspectives that will shape the trajectory of educational research and training in the coming decade or two. And we're so honored to have four distinguished speakers, Doctors Catherine Strunk, Catherine Bradshaw, Wijekumar, and Susan Therriault, who have dedicated their efforts to conducting impactful research that seeks to understand and address the effects of COVID-19 on students' academic, social-emotional learning, and as well as the teaching workforce. During each speaker's presentation, we encourage you to submit your questions in the Q&A box. Our moderator, Liz Albro, will select a few questions to be addressed at the end of each presentation as we transition to the next speaker. She'll also facilitate the Q&A sections at the end. Once again, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all attendees of IES-PI meeting. And without further ado, let's proceed to our speakers.
Thank you. And I think I get to kick us off today. I'm going to share my screen so you all can see my slides. Let's see if this works. Great. Oh. Okay. So today we're going to have a long conversation about what happened to kids in schools during the pandemic. And I'm going to start us off with just looking at one slice of that, which is what happened to schools in Michigan during the pandemic in terms of student achievement. Obviously, this is just one slice of the puzzle, and we're going to talk about other important impacts of the pandemic on kids as well. Before I start, I want to thank the amazing EPIC team who has done all this work tirelessly through the pandemic in partnership with the Department of Education in Michigan and other stakeholders across the state. So I don't think any of us really need the background, especially with the news over the last week or so. So I'm not going to go into too much depth, except for to say that there's a lot of growing evidence that the COVID-19 pandemic has substantially impacted student achievement across the country and across the nation, across the world. So we're going to look at a deep dive on Michigan today, and particularly understand three questions. First, how did Michigan students' growth during the pandemic compare to that of similar students before the pandemic? And to do this, we're going to look at the summative assessments that students took in the cohort that was learning prior to the pandemic, so between 2016 and 2019, and the cohort that was learning during the pandemic, who took a test in 2019. Obviously, we didn't have tests in 2020, and we had very low rates of participation in 2021. And then we'll look at the test scores in 2022. So we're going to compare those two groups of students and see how their achievement grew on summative tests. We also in Michigan, the governor and the state required that districts administer benchmark assessments during the pandemic so that EPIC could work with the state to be able to understand how students were progressing kind of in real time. And so we'll look at those assessment scores to understand not just the summative outcomes, but also how Michigan student achievement changed throughout the pandemic. And of course, it's particularly important to us to understand how this varied by different factors that we think really matter for students, including economic disadvantage, race and ethnicity, and the kinds of instructional modality that was offered by their districts. A little preview of our results. I don't think it'll be a surprise to know that we saw far less math growth and slightly less ELA growth during the pandemic relative to pre-pandemic cohorts of students, and we'll show you that. We did see particularly steep declines in that earliest phase of the pandemic, kind of going into the 2021 school year. And we saw some recovery in 21-22 with a long way to go. And we did find substantially larger negative effects for students of color, for students who are low income, and for students that were enrolled in districts that were operating remotely during 2021. quickly, just a little bit of background on some of our initial analysis. So this is our look at the summative assessments. And I just want to clarify again that we're looking at the cohort of students that was learning during the pandemic, so over the 2019 to 2022 school years. And we compare them to students in the same district, similar students who were learning in the prior years in 2016 to 2019. So here's our first results slide. And I want to show, we had 3 different models that we ran. Our preferred model is in this teal color over here. And we include controls for all sorts of district and student characteristics. We also include a control for COVID incidents measured by COVID death rates in each community so that we could understand sort of some of the larger impacts of the pandemic, not just only on schools. And we also include district fixed effects in this model. And I think it's a pretty clear picture. We see math on the left, we see ELA on the right. And this 0 line shows us the pre-pandemic cohorts learning gains. And this is the bars and the dots show us the difference for the pandemic cohort relative to the pre-pandemic cohort. And what you can see here in our preferred model is that students learned about 0.2 standard deviations less in terms of achievement growth on math during the pandemic relative to their pre-pandemic peers. We see less of a negative effect during the pandemic for ELA, although it is still negative, but not significant, as you can see here. Now we break it down by different student subgroups. And so we're looking at white students, Black students, Latino students. We don't have enough of Asian students or other race and ethnicity students in Michigan to use them as a comparison group. And we also look at students who are economically disadvantaged versus students who are not economically disadvantaged. The 0 line now shows us the reference group for that pre-pandemic cohort, so for white and higher income students. And the blue dots show us the gaps that existed prior to the pandemic, and the green dots show us the gaps that exist in the pandemic cohort. Again, I'll look at math here. What you can see is that even prior to the pandemic, there were gaps between student achievement for Black versus white students or Latino students, and also for lower income versus their wealthier peers. These gaps grew substantially throughout the pandemic, such that you can see here, for instance, for Black students, it was about 0.35 standard deviations lower student achievement gains than students in the pre-pandemic, the white students in the pre-pandemic cohort. So our gap substantially increased across the pandemic in math and in ELA, although much more in math. Now I'm going to show you what happened with schools and districts that were operating in remotely during the pandemic. And so this is during the 2021 school year. EPIC partnered with the state to collect data from every single district every single month during the 2021 school year to understand what instructional modalities they were offering to their students. So here you see districts that were offering in-person instruction for all 9 months. And then these bars here show you districts that were offering in-person instruction for the majority of the school year, for less than half of the school year, or they did not open for in-person instruction at all during the school year. And the takeaway here is, again, fairly clear. For students that were learning that had access to in-person instruction for the whole school year, they still saw a pretty substantial decrease in student achievement gains in math in the pandemic cohort relative to the pre-pandemic cohort, but it was larger for students who were learning remotely for at least part of the year. Interestingly, we don't see significant or even substantial differences between the student achievement growth that were for students who were learning for just a little less than half of the year or more than half of the year or not at all remotely. Everybody basically who was learning remotely for part of the year at all saw bigger achievement losses than students who were learning in person the whole year. Same thing for ELA, although again, not as significant or substantial. So now we're going to take a dive into what happened during the pandemic. Again, we're going to look at these 2021 and 21-22 trajectories for student achievement growth on benchmark assessments. We use the NWA and the iReady here. Not all districts in Michigan use those 2 tests, but the far majority did, and so you'll see that. And we're comparing now students in the pandemic relative to these benchmark assessment providers' national norms that were done before the pandemic. And so I'm going to orient you to this graph here for a second. The green line is ELA or reading. The purpley blue line is math. We do show you the M-steps, the sort of the summative assessments in 2019 and in 2022. We obviously didn't have those for 2020 or 2021. And what I want you to really focus on is a few things here. First, it's clear that by fall 2020, so the very beginning of the pandemic, Michigan students were already seeing lower achievement on these benchmark assessments than pre-pandemic national norm. We give you the ELA M-step here. They're not entirely equatable, but they are correlated at about 0.89. So we give you these to show you that the students in our sample were scoring a little bit below what we would have expected in the national norm prior to the pandemic. When you see this really big drop, especially in math by fall 2020. If we saw students learning at the expected rate, as the benchmark assessment providers would have suggested that the expected rate of growth would have been, you would see a flat line here. But what we see instead in 20 to 21 is substantial and very steep decreases in student achievement as measured by these achievement tests. In particular, actually in ELA or reading, but in both math and ELA. Over the summer, students gained a little more than we would have expected in a traditional school year. And then by fall 2021 into 2022, we see math kind of leveling off, but we see some decreases again for ELA in that year. These are on average across all these districts. So we see a little bit of a rebound over time, but not enough to get students back up to where they would have been prior to the pandemic. Here we break it down by race ethnicity. So this top line is white students. Then here we have Latino and African American or Black students in green. And what you can see is, for starters, white students in Michigan consistently scored at higher levels. But importantly, they saw much less steep decreases between fall 2020 and spring 2021. And African American students saw the biggest decrease in that year, in particular in math, but also in ELA. Students did begin to rebound and stayed on a rebound trajectory over the next school year, but they still ended up their 2022 school year substantially below what we would expect from a pre-pandemic national norm. And actually, these gaps got bigger between white and Latino and white and Black students. Here we have it for low-income students in the green versus higher income students in the purple, and you see the exact same story. And then the last one we're going to show here are for the students who were learning in different modalities across the year. A couple of really important takeaways here. This dark blue line is the students who had access to in-person instruction for the entire 2021 school year, and we trace them into the following school year as well. Importantly, these students were not enrolled in districts that were higher achieving to begin with. So in fact, most of these districts were very rural districts in Michigan that were able to stay open for the whole school year. And we see they kind of were flat during 2021. It was sort of business as usual. But the other districts all had steep declines in that first school year. They started to catch up over the 2021-22 school year and kind of more return to a business as usual year. But they were not able to kind of recoup all that learning that had happened in the districts that were in person for the whole time. So we think there are a couple of really important takeaways. The first one is that, look, the COVID-19 pandemic substantially impacted student achievement during the 2021 school year in ways that really caused particular certain groups of students to have substantial interruptions to their learning. And while there was some rebounding in 21-22, we're still a long way to go. So we're not there yet. And when we hear that people are telling us that we're back to business as usual, that may be the case in some places for some students, but not on average, and particularly not for students who are learning in districts that were remote for more of the school year during 2021, or students who are traditionally maybe underserved by the public school system. So Black students, Latino students, and low-income students. So we have two takeaways. One of these is, we need to keep on providing resources, both monetary, but also just other kinds of resources to the communities that were most impacted by the pandemic, and to help these students continue to ramp up their learning and recoup. And secondly, while many people are telling us, we don't have to collect these data anymore, now we know where we are, we don't agree. We think it's really important to keep on collecting the data and tracking these students to make sure that we see where students are coming out at the end of each school year or during the school year, so we can really target our interventions accurately. I'm going to end it there so that we have time for the other panelists.
All right, does anyone have a quick question for Catherine? Oops, I'm realizing I don't have my video on. Anyone have a quick question? Just put it in the Q&A if you have any questions, and I will read them out because I don't think you all can talk. I'll give people a second to type. I see lots of things, but it's all about the fact that they could hear me talking before. Okay, here we go. A question from Ken Frank Catherine. He says, can you identify any of the basis of any recovery that you see in 2021, 2022?
That is a great question. We have been doing some qualitative work with a wonderful team, including Aisha Hashim and Haley Weddle, and they have been going into what we call these successful case districts, so districts that did see higher than expected growth in both of those school years. And they're showing a couple of things. I don't have the 21-22 data quite coded and analyzed yet. I think that's coming in the fall. But from 2021, we can see that these districts were those that had really good systems in place prior to the pandemic. So even if they weren't already high achieving prior to the pandemic, they had good systems in place. They had a lot of trust and communication with families and parents. And they were quick to kind of work across silos. And so they were able to say, we're going to work with our special ed teachers in collaboration with our general ed teachers. We're going to work with all the different groups in the district to make sure that we are understanding which kids are being hardest hit and how we can really affect change for those particular children.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We have 2 more quick questions and then we'll move to our next speaker. And I will keep putting the questions in the chat and we'll have some time at the end as well. So Adam Winsler wonders if we have any information by English learner status.
We do have by ELL status, we don't see substantial differences there. And we also don't have huge populations of ELLs in all the districts in Michigan. And so they're very much concentrated in a few districts. So it was sort of hard to figure out what was going on there. But it is in the larger report, which is on the EPIC website if you're interested.
Fabulous. Last question, which is a big question, so you can answer it shortly now and we can talk about it longer. Any speculations about the different patterns we're seeing for reading and math?
Yeah, I think we're seeing this across the country. And I think one of the things we wonder if is happening is, kids can read at home and they can be helped at home a lot more by their families potentially in how they read, but it's a little bit harder to do math that way. And so we wonder if that's part of what's happening, is that sort of it's easier to kind of translate the reading instruction to home, but harder to translate that math instruction.
Fabulous. Catherine, thank you so much. And we are going to move to our next speaker. And Catherine, there's some specifics in the chat or the Q&A that you can do it. And now Catherine Bradshaw is going to take a different perspective onto what happened during the pandemic. Catherine, over to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to share with you a little bit about some of the broader impacts that are happening in schools during the pandemic and as part of this recovery process. It's great to hear about the academic impacts, but also I want to kind of broaden the conversation a little bit to talk about some of the interrelated social, emotional, behavioral, and mental health concerns that we are now really only starting to learn much more about. In fact, there was just recently a release of this very important report from the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine that have talked not only about impacts for children, but also for families, as we are learning much more about the persistent impacts of the pandemic. In fact, the unprecedented burden, not only on students, but on teachers, educators, these are still very much with us, and what I refer to as this peri-pandemic period. We saw very immediate impacts on students and teachers as they were trying to pull together resources about how to provide online learning supports for students, and even trying to cope with their own experience of the pandemic and the stress that brought. And there were a host of studies that came out immediately, some by our team and certainly by others, documenting the impacts. But now we are starting to really understand some of these more persistent impacts. But even well before the stress of the pandemic, we knew that teaching was a very stressful situation for many educators. And you add on these types of persistent impacts. So we are now starting to see some pretty serious workforce issues that are creeping up. So I want to make sure that we're keeping our staff and educators part of this conversation as we try to have a recovery process that's inclusive of all of the important stakeholders. Prior to the pandemic, we had pretty solid data that was pretty consistent, showing that about 20% of youth were experiencing serious mental health issues in schools. And while that number popped around a little bit over the years, most of the students were able to get some support services within the schools. In fact, the schools provided the best opportunity for access to service for many students. But when we compound the challenges of the COVID pandemic, we see really skyrocketing rates of mental health concerns, 40% increase in mental health concerns since the onset of the pandemic. And that comes in the form of 20% of youth reporting depressive symptoms, 25% anxiety symptoms, and a 50% increase in suicide attempts since the onset of the pandemic. And like you, we had many studies that were in the field that were disrupted by the pandemic. This is just a snapshot of one of our relatively smaller studies that we had of early career teachers that we were providing some supports to and training in classroom management and coaching that were concentrated in some urban schools. And like you, being a bit disrupted, we were also a bit creative. And so we pivoted to provide some opportunities to collect data on what impact does the COVID pandemic have on the workforce that we were trying to support. Unfortunately, many of those teachers ended up leaving the field, but the ones that we have been able to continue to stay in contact with, we were trying to collect information on. And so we got data in the spring of 2021, the spring of 2022, and are now fielding data from them. And so this is just under 100 teachers that we've been able to stay in contact with. And we asked them questions about how their experience of the pandemic impacted their support of students. And so in this particular data here, higher is worse and reflecting more concern about students. And we aren't seeing quite as quick recovery as we had hoped. We've found about half of the sample felt that their students were unprepared to learn in 2021 as well as 2022. Still pretty persistent concerns about student stress and pretty high rates of concern about students, 89% in 2021 and 82% of concern about students in 2022. We did see some improvement, certainly in terms of their perceived ability to help students' academic needs, as well as their ability to meet some of the students' social emotional needs. But still, just over a quarter of the staff felt that they weren't able to cope with some of the professional challenges that they had as educators. And apathy is a concern, especially as we read more and more about this quiet quitting phenomena, that educators are still working and need additional supports to deal with their own stress. So this is reflective of concerns about how do we go about reestablishing conditions for not only learning for students, but teaching. And I turn to some of the really tried and true foundations for improving conditions that we have good, solid data for, and models such as positive behavior support and the National Technical Assistance Center continue to be up and running and providing a lot of support for schools as they reopen and continue to make solid investments in schools and be nimble and providing supports to schools. Schools have gotten a lot of resources in some cases, but are quick to turn to different types of models. And it's really important they rebuild these foundations on solid evidence-based models and rebuilding those systems, turning to evidence-based practices like social emotional learning, and building on good, solid data systems to inform their practices. I want to highlight a couple that we've been working with. We are fortunate to be part of a National Center for Rural School Mental Health that's funded by IES, directed by my colleague, Wendy Rinke, that spans the state of Missouri, Montana, and Virginia. And we were funded right before the pandemic hit. And it's been great to be able to provide schools in rural communities access to the early identification system, that is the screening system to help teachers access evidence-based practices and screening tools that help students identify different types of mental health concerns, or better yet, educators provide support to students through efficient and rigorous methods for assessing needs. And we were able to scale up these models, which is very, very helpful, especially in rural settings where often schools don't have access to evidence-based practices. And this was fortunate to be able to have resources to be able to reach far and wide, especially right prior to the onset of the pandemic. And while we are most immediately supporting schools in rural settings, having these resources available online has been also very helpful for schools in other communities as well. And screening tools are very, very essential in communities. And I think some schools and communities have been a bit anxious about them, but I think it takes sometimes a bit of a moment such as this for us to realize how important it is to be aware of these kinds of tools, and especially the need for students to be able to have access to mental health support services within schools. I also want to highlight the tiered types of frameworks. Some schools refer to these as positive behavior support or multi-tiered systems of support. This really comes out of a solid public health approach, and hopefully you're familiar with some of these frameworks. Obviously, we think about this within the school setting as it relates to students, but we could also think about this as it relates to staff and how we provide staff supports to staff, maybe less so in the mental health area, but also thinking about other kinds of well-being supports to make sure that we're rebuilding supports and infrastructure to meet staff and provide wellness, to rebuild the infrastructure around elements of support. I do a lot of work where we integrate elements of social emotional learning with positive behavior support and have complementary integration of those evidence-based models. And we can think of the operating system of a multi-tiered system of support, and that those complementary systems fit together in a nice framework that helps ensure high quality implementation and fidelity of interventions, rather than just kind of a kitchen sink type of model. And I think sometimes schools rush to implement the brand new shiny framework without really reflecting on the data systems and practices. And it's these kinds of times where schools need to be very consistent and thoughtful in rebuilding these frameworks and thinking about what kind of vision that they want to have for a sustainable model of implementation of supports across the different levels of implementation in their buildings. And in fact, our team has done pretty extensive research on positive behavior support. I've been the PI and co-PI on 4 different trials, randomized controlled trials funded by IES, Department of Ed, and National Institute of Justice. And we have outcomes showing significant impacts on bullying, suspensions, a range of outcomes for students as well as staff on positive behavior support. And those span not only reducing problem outcomes for students, but also improving conditions for learning. And those include positive outcomes for school staff. We spend a lot of time talking about leadership improvement, and we don't have always the optimal models for that, but we have shown that through positive behavior support, we can actually improve the collegial leadership and relationships for school staff. And so I would encourage us to revisit some of those frameworks as we're thinking about how to rebuild systems of support within schools. And in terms of some of the lessons learned about rebuilding these frameworks, our research does show that we tend to get stronger effects at the elementary school level, and that you get quite a lot of investment and bang for your buck, so to speak, at the tier 1 levels. And we also get quite a lot of investment for higher risk students. And in fact, now with the recovery process, we might have a higher proportion of students in that higher risk zone. And we can see quite a bit of benefit of some synergistic effects with integration with social emotional learning. But we do need to have strong investments in coaching and implementation supports to have high quality implementation and fidelity, and good partnerships with districts and state support. And we've also done a number of cost studies to show a high return on investment through reductions in suspensions and mental health concerns. We've also partnered with our colleagues to think about reductions in discipline as it relates to disproportionality through coaching and culturally responsive practices, and have had a number of projects funded by IES focused on disproportionality. And so much of that work we've now scaled up and put online, and in a very thoughtful and collaborative way. And so I just want to highlight, now we're much more in a focused way of thinking about scaling up evidence-based practices as the field thinks about research to practice partnership and the ESRA reauthorization. I think we are at a tipping point in the field of education research that we need to be thinking much more about implementation and implementation science and the future of where are we really going to go with the next stage of research. And the pandemic has really brought to our attention this broader question about partnerships and research and the conditions for learning and the timely kind of research that we need to be doing, and how we need to be much more nimble about the research designs that we have and how we can scale up evidence-based practices. And with that, I want to highlight the future. I think of much of the research that we need to be doing is thinking about implementation science, and it's great that IES is already headed in that direction. And one example of that is the RISE Institute for Implementation Science that IES has already been investing in. So with that, I will pause and pass it back to Liz. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. And thanks for the shout out and help us as we're thinking about what happens with Ezra. So we do have a question for you. Jason Snipes wants to know what the impacts of PBS on suspensions look like for Black students in magnitude compared to the impacts on students from other racial groups. Do you?
Yes, so we've done quite a bit of research in that area. And while we started out really hoping we were going to see a closing of the gap with regard to the tier 1 supports, we actually see that we're not closing the gap, but we are narrowing the overall rates of suspensions. And so that's one reason why we launched into the work around our double check work, was that we found that only when we brought in more intentional coaching and training around culturally responsive practices did we see that narrowing of the gap. So we saw an overall reduction in suspensions, but we didn't see that narrowing until we did more intentional coaching and professional development around culturally responsive practices. I think that's pretty consistent with other studies as well, including some work out of the Oregon team.
Awesome, thank you. That's great. I'm just waiting here to see if there are any other specific questions for you as Kay gets ready to go into the next session. I think it's really interesting and important, and I'm glad to hear about the sort of availability of resources for folks who are interested in implementing this kind of work in their own school systems. So I think that's good. All right, well, I'm gonna, people please type in other questions for Catherine so that she can answer them and that we can answer them, but I'm gonna go ahead and keep us on, keep us going on. So Kay Wijekumar, will you please take us away?
Thank you very much, Liz and Sue. I'm honored to present to you how IES-funded projects were helpful in addressing the literacy needs of children before, during, and after the pandemic. It is an interesting follow-up to Director Schneider's call to action of timeliness and translation. Thanks to IES, we were right in the right place at the right time with the right tools to overcome many of the pandemic-related challenges. And this is a whole team effort, and a very special team at that. We have all of the resources that were funded by IES through multiple grants listed here, including the Intelligent Tutoring System for the Structure Strategy and the Spanish version called Strategy Instruction on the Web for English Learners, SWELL. Our work is a team effort with wonderful collaborators who are all listed here, and also 50 teacher ambassadors and many dedicated practitioners. The resources and success I share with you today were supported by the grants listed on the bottom of the screen, and also through multiple program officers, including our very first program officer in 2001, who happened to be the now Commissioner Liz Albro. So thanks to all of the amazing people. We have received multiple acknowledgements for our work, including US News and World Report, and also multiple studies that have been reviewed by the What Works Clearinghouse, and actually shown evidence standards that meet evidence standards without any reservations. However, this is all good news, but there are quite a few potholes along this road. And back in 2016, we had an interesting encounter in a classroom that led to everything that I'm going to present to you today. A 4th grade child participating in the SWELL project asked me, why should I use your strategy? Because my teacher told me to do something different. In fact, the child pointed to the textbook and graphic organizer that clearly contradicted our instruction. We realized then and there that we need a much deeper understanding of what was happening in the intervention classrooms outside of our instructional time. Let me repeat that. Intervention classrooms outside of our instructional time. This is an important distinction and is quite different than reporting fidelity to the intervention during that time, or even explaining what happens in the control classrooms. So this is about something that's happening in the intervention, something or someone that was contradicting our instruction and potentially diminishing the effects of the intervention. This was the beginning of our journey, seeking to understand causes for the reading comprehension problems. We examined the scope and sequence of the state standards, the textbooks, the professional development routines that were given to the teachers, teacher knowledge, teacher practices, administrator knowledge and willingness to support implementation, and also measures and state tests. What we uncovered was a complex set of challenges that, as many of you know, I'm into text structures, about causes for the problem, which talk about the textbooks, the misuse of the text structures, reading words for fluency without making connections while they're reading, unproven strategies. By the way, there are hundreds of them in the classrooms and the textbooks, misleading tests. The tests are actually designed to mislead children, especially children growing up in dire socioeconomic circumstances. They are not used to the academic vocabulary, and it is very, very misleading to them. So this deeper understanding of the context led to our team's effort starting in 2018 with a seed grant to develop the Knowledge Acquisition and Transformation CAT framework that addresses the root causes of the problems facing children today. So in the CAT framework, we onboard teachers differently. We do our professional development quite differently. We actually insist that the principals and coaches from the schools are present and fully engaged in the professional development. We provide a 360-degree support system, a safety net of sorts for both teachers and administrators that includes monthly CAT chats and weekly PLC or grade level support and office hours. We repurposed our student ITSS to provide asynchronous, on-demand, web-based professional development to teachers and administrators. We also created a completely new cycle and a next generation of ITSS that focuses on vocabulary, main idea generation, extension of the main idea to summaries, extrapolating inferences, and leveraging those main ideas, summaries, and inferences to support character traits, author's purpose, other reading comprehension skills that are covered in the state standards. We also focused on showing children how to navigate the constructs that were measured. We did all this in English and Spanish, and most of this was done before the pandemic, utilizing the seed grant. Since our team works on developing and testing web-based tools, mostly funded by IES, we were well poised to support our schools during and after the pandemic. By 2019, we had produced thousands of instructional videos, lesson plans, games, in multiple genres of text, narrative, expository, poetry, biography. Our content includes different domains, science, social studies, current events for grades K through 12. Talk about timeliness and translation. Additionally, I want to remind you that all of our resources are fully available in English and Spanish, so we were able to bring these resources to an even larger audience. Now, I work primarily in Texas right now, in border towns that are highly stressed socioeconomically as well as community-wise. We are in dire circumstances in many of these places, and we have large numbers of English learners and many students that come in and out of the system very quickly. Our student and practitioner focused style and care really made a strong positive impact on the students and their teachers during this pandemic. So when the pandemic decided to unleash its havoc on our schools, our team didn't miss a beat. We've stepped fully into embracing this complexity for our schools and became the beacon of hope for our teachers and administrators. We curated the resources and provided a safe space, warm environment, and a professional learning community that lifted each other up. So I'm going to begin with Ms. Kimberly Suggs and her success story for about 2 minutes before I carry on with the rest of my presentation.
I'm Kimberly Suggs. I'm a 4th grade teacher here at Grand Prairie at Garner Fine Arts Academy. And today I'm going to be showing you how I've used the CAT strategy in my 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grade classrooms. I was first introduced to CAT transitioning from 2nd grade to 3rd grade. And like, I kind of freaked out because I'd never taught a STAR grade before. I didn't know what I was doing. It's like, okay, you want me to go and teach a STAR testing grade, you know, I really don't know what to use to make sure that my students are successful. So we had the CAT training with Dr. K and Ashley and everyone, and they said it worked. And I was like, okay, all these people telling me all of their success stories, they said it worked. They said, make sure you do it every day. So I believed in them. And so me not knowing really, you know, what to do with my 3rd graders, I just went straight forward with the CAT strategy. So we implemented it every single day. I did it whole group, small group, guided reading group, tutoring groups. Every single time we did a text, we implemented the CAT strategy. And like I said, that was my first year ever using CAT and my first year ever using the, teaching a testing grade. And we had 100% passing on STAR. So that was my success with that. I was asked to go back to 2nd grade to help those students coming in so that they would be ready for 3rd grade. So we did a really great job teaching the strategy with our 2nd graders. And then now this year I got moved up to 4th. So we're going to be continuing to use that strategy. And one thing with this group, this will be their 3rd year using it. And so I'm not really having to teach directly, you know, what the strategies are. Like, we're diving right into comprehension, and they're doing a really great job with that. So I have a couple of slides.
So that's Mrs. Suggs. She's not just a single outlier. We have 58 upper elementary classrooms, grades 3, 4, and 5, that achieved 100% pass rates in the 2021-2022 academic year. This was done across multiple school districts. And Mrs. Suggs actually started in 2020 with Zoom-based professional development and has been successful throughout. So we have, this is a very unusual kind of situation. And not only did 58 out of the 221 teachers achieve 100% pass rates, that's including the special education students, the English language learners on their state level reading test, but every other teacher who worked with us also showed 5 to 30 point gains on the student scores on the test. It is heartwarming to hear from the students, the teachers, and the administrators about their success. And our work was even more valued and embraced by the school communities because of the contrast to what was happening in the world. I think we really made such a positive impact on them, to the point where many of them were inquiring what we could provide to the families. So now we have what's called an ACE podcast available in Spanish and in English, and it's available in all free platforms, including WhatsApp, because that's what most of the Latino communities in the border towns use. So let me just share with you, going back to our strategies, how we transformed by design. So we had the ITSS and SWAL for students, the teacher practice-based professional development, customized content, which I'm going to share with you in a couple of seconds, and weekly and monthly encouragement and support. Our ITSS tool is an instructional platform that provides web-based tutoring to students one-on-one and shows them how to use the text structure to select important ideas, connect these ideas logically, and generate a main idea using that text structure, and then extending that main idea and a gist to a summary, and extrapolate inferences. There are causal inferences that you can make using the text structure, and then leveraging all of these 3 things to extend to other language arts constructs like author's purpose, character traits, and things like that. So this is one-on-one tutoring done by an animated pedagogical agent, resources available in English and Spanish, and instructional passages that were designed by our team. Further, you've seen this slide before, but I just want to call attention to the fact that during the professional development, we use the school level materials to plan and deliver instruction. Small groups are led by our teacher ambassadors who actually plan with the teachers for the first 6 weeks of instruction. By the way, our PD is 2 full days. And then we do a gradual release model where we allow the schools and the teachers and the coaches to plan the next 6 weeks. And during the second 12 weeks of the academic year, the teachers are doing the planning with their school leaders. And then in the last 12 weeks, they do it fully independently. By the way, all of our resources are then crowdsourced and shared back into our teacher library. So we have develop materials that serve multiple textbook series as well as resources for classroom use that are preferred by teachers. Like they like to use a storybook. We actually plan and present that with instructional videos and all the resources for them. We have a monthly cat chat, which provides a showcase for teachers to share and discuss among themselves. We have over 5,000 teachers now enrolled in our platform, and many of them, if they don't attend the session, will come in and watch the videos after the fact. Our crowdsourced resources are curated by our team to make sure that the quality is maintained. It has over 5,000 resources. Compared to the 50 lessons on ITSS, we have 5,000 resources that support the local school's needs, including lesson guides, videos, PowerPoints, Nearpod, Google Collaborate, Poll Everywhere, Slick Text, you name it. We have used every technology out there to support the schools. So I'm happy to answer any questions about how we achieve this success or what we do. And I think this sort of a safe space was essential. It just so happened that IES started us off on the right track very early in 2001 with a wonderful program officer. And here we are 23 years later, sharing our success with you. So here are some of our newsletters. You all can join, get involved with our project if you're interested. And I'm happy to share some of the testimonials with you as well. And I'm ready for questions.
All right, we're going to take one question, and then Susan, we're going to go to Susan because I'm looking at the time, and I know we're already running about 5 minutes late. Fortunately, my recorded session and Jackie's, I think, are relatively short. So let's see. I think Andrea Truckenmiller wants to know, Kay, what are the key levers that you're finding for pre-service teacher preparation?
Oh, very good question. For the pre-service teacher preparation, we have actually done two things. One is we've introduced these resources into many of our classes intentionally. And we also have a reading clinic and places where these pre-service teachers are doing their student teaching. In every one of those cases, they're actually taking these packages, and every one of our teachers, pre-service teachers, are also invited to the professional development. And so they're actually learning to interact with the in-service teachers and getting valuable experiences that they can actually take out there as well.
Awesome. And you can answer Jim's question in the chat. Thank you guys so much. And now Susan is going to share with us a new project that is just getting launched, a network that she's leading. And so Susan, with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Liz, and thanks everyone. So my presentation is a bit different. We are, as Liz mentioned, relatively newly started. I am leading a project that is called the Pre-K through 12 Research on Education Strategies to Advance Recovery and Turnaround Network, and we call it the Restart Network. So it's a network that's funded by IES, and I'll tell you a little bit about it. And really, most of my presentation is going to be about talking to you about ways to engage with the network and share your findings and studies, because we know you're doing lots of great work, including my colleagues who have just presented, that might be shared more abundantly. I will say also, one of the key pieces of the network is to speak to what Mark mentioned in his opening, which is timeliness and translation. Those are the primary foci of the network for sure. So what is the Restart Network? As I mentioned, it's funded by IES. It is multifaceted. It provides some intensive coordination to 5 core research teams, which are embarking on IES-funded studies or that have been conducting these studies for a bit of time. We are also trying to engage the research community writ large, like yourselves, through sharing of reporting and findings by creating meaningful connections to the field. And that includes continuous needs assessment and trying to understand from the voices of the field, including policymakers, leaders, and practitioners, of what their needs are and how they're evolving, and making connections and making sure that the research that folks like you are providing are offered to these key policymakers, leaders, and practitioners in ways that make sense to them and are easily accessible. So I'm going to kind of move through this because I think that we're all aware of the case for a network like this. We need, the biggest challenge we have is time and trying to get evidence-based strategies into the hands of people who need them now. We're continuing to work on that, and I'll talk about ways that we're trying to do that. So the big elements of the network are need sensing, synthesizing evidence-based strategies and research, disseminating information about that, creating a national network that with purpose brings together policymakers, leaders, practitioners, and the research communities, including representations of associations, and then holding national forums where we can have some of those conversations with each other in person and virtually. And then within the core research network, which are those 5 research teams that I'll mention a little bit more later, we're working with them to kind of create some networking opportunities to share strategies and information. I will say some of that is focused on recruitment, which I know we're all struggling with a bit. Supporting early career researchers that are on those teams, but making those learning opportunities available to a larger audience of early career researchers as well. Building evidence through their findings, shaping their analyses and the way they're doing their work based on the needs as we're understanding them in the field, and then developing and amplifying their work through audience designed dissemination of information. So where are we now? One thing that we are doing is facilitating convenings. We've actually met with our core research team several times. We've actually been kind of growing with the core research teams. We're set at now 5. We're across the teams, we're developing something called solutions working groups, and those are groups that are designed purposefully to be short-term, come together, struggling with an issue or challenge, create some consensus around that, and kind of develop some principles that we actually will share publicly. So for others who may be struggling with this, I will say that one of the solutions working groups is really looking at participation and recruitment. So I'm sure that will be of interest to others as well. And then we're in the process of planning early career researcher training, which we'll publicize for sure. In terms of the scans and syntheses, when we originally planned on this, we were kind of looking at particular COVID-related strategies that could support unfinished learning or learning recovery. We have been blasted like with a fire hose of research that's out there. We're in the process of screening all of the research that we're finding. This is what we've screened so far is about 3,500 unique citations. That's only with one portion of our protocol, which we'll be making public as well. So we're in the process of vetting those right now. We plan to have something available to folks in June. So we'll have at least an initial synthesis in June that we'd be happy to share. We're also convening a national forum. Our first forum will be quite intimate. We have a limited amount of findings at this point. So we'll be primarily listening to the field in terms of what their needs are and discussing nuances of some of those strategies. That will be at the end of May. And then we're in the process of developing communication strategies and kind of streamlining some of that work. And I strongly encourage you to log on to our website, restartnetwork.org, if you have more questions about that. So we are really a coordinator in this instance. So we're synthesizing research, trying to really understand the needs of the field, mostly to inform our 5 core research teams. They have a broad representation, tons of expertise in the field, and are really embarking on some really interesting studies. We have Georgia State University, which is the newest team to join us, that's looking at the pandemic recovery strategies in Georgia. The North Carolina Department of Public Instruction and UNC Chapel Hill have partnered to look at extension programs, especially focusing on summer programs, and they do have some findings from last summer. And then the University of Chicago Consortium on School Research in Chicago Public Schools is looking at a curriculum for learning acceleration and grades K through 2 in Chicago Public Schools, and that's underway. In California, the Public Policy Institute of California, along with the California Department of Education, along with many others, I should say, they are the leads, but they have a broad collaboration really focused on understanding how pandemic recovery is rolling out in California. And then finally, AIR and the Illinois State Board of Education have partnered to really look at learning renewal, and specifically a social emotional learning program that they're implementing throughout Illinois. So we're bringing these teams together kind of to discuss issues that are arising and make sure they're getting the types of support that they need, and also making sure they're connected in meaningful ways to the field. So I'm going to kind of move through these kind of quickly, just because I know I want to make sure we have time for others. But I do want to say that there are several ways to engage with the Restart Network. We are just starting up, and we would love to hear from you. There's a you could sign up for just regular communications on what's going on with, we'll have a regular newsletter that's coming out, as well as sharing resources and things that come out as we have findings from the core research teams. Please share your studies and research findings. We'd love to include those as something that we're sharing with the field. And so if you have studies, and we know that the pace of studies has been so quick that there hasn't been a lot necessarily time to even put them into publication, or you're working on that. Please share what you have that you've made public with us. We're happy to take a look at that and think through ways that that might speak to the needs of the field. Also, we have a resource library where we're, we have a vetting process to include resources for researchers as well as policymakers. And we have also LinkedIn, and we have Twitter and that sort of thing. So please, please join us. I think that what we're trying to do is create a valuable resource for the field to meet their needs. And it's a really nice way and platform for you to amplify your findings and your research moving forward. And we'd love to help with that. So with that, I know it's brief, but I did want to make sure there were time for questions. Liz, I'm turning it back to you.
Thank you, Susan. No, that was great. And there's lots to come, right? So the idea here is that we've started with some historical work, talking about what was learned during the pandemic, highlighted 2 bodies of work that Catherine Bradshaw and Kay have been working on for many decades, and closed out with the future. So folks, does anyone, just a quick note, the commissioner videos are not going to start till 1:15. So we do have time for questions. If anyone has a question for Susan. And here I'm looking to see, and I'm doing my wait time. Although I think everyone wants to know what the commissioners are going to say. I was like, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I recorded it like a month ago. So you guys are going to have to, you'll know it better than I do. If not, I think I do want to give people a few minutes. Susan, I want to thank you for sort of giving us the future. I really do want to encourage everyone, for those of you who are doing, everyone's projects are impacted by COVID. So please follow Susan on her various networks. continue to pay attention. If you have studies that Susan and her team should be considering as they're doing a scan of the literature, Catherine, I'm assuming your work is already in there, but if it's not, let's make sure we get all of the work together. Sorry, Susan, more work for you. But I think it's, I think it's really important, and we're super excited to have this network and to be able to convene and share information with the field about everything that we're learning about how to accelerate learning, given that this is a key need, and hopefully closing the gaps that we are all well aware of and that have been exacerbated over time. And with that, I don't think we can clap. I want to clap. I want to clap everyone here, and I'm losing my background. Just say thank you, everyone, for all of your wonderful comments, and for everyone in the Q&A. Thank you for your questions. If you have specific questions for your colleagues here, please don't hesitate to reach out to them directly. I am sure that they will be happy to answer. And with that, I think everyone could probably use 5 minutes before we move to the next section of the PI meeting. So thank you again, and we'll see you in the next session. Take care. Bye, everybody. Thanks. Thanks.